welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm back in Fitzrovia today, a part of London that I visited about 2 years ago, I think it was now. In that previous video I came to all of the famous pubs with their literary associations, like the Fitzroy Tavern behind me here and the Wheatsheaf over there, and some other pubs that are lauded for their interiors, like the Stag's Head and the Champion. I'm not going to revisit those same pubs today. Instead, I have a different itinerary. A handful of pubs have piqued my curiosity here in Fitzrovia for various different reasons. It is such a rich seam of interesting historic pubs. Pub number one, the King and Queen. Cheers from the King and Queen. I've walked past this pub a few times and it's often piqued my curiosity, but I've somehow never been in before. And I think what finally pushed me over the threshold was that I recently heard it has the same owners as the Red Lion on Crown Passage in St James's, which is one of my favourite pubs of all time. Let's take a look at the exterior first. It's a very eye-catching building. It's a listed building, and Historic England are of the opinion that it's late Victorian, circa 1890 to 1900. Camera, on the other hand, suggests they think it's Edwardian, but I think the consensus there is sometime around 1900. Historic England described the style as lively, rather Frenchified Gothic design. It's of course identified as Gothic primarily because of those pointed arched windows. In the Victorian era, Gothic and Classical were the two main competing architectural styles, but in terms of pubs, it seems that Classical was by far the more popular choice. It's actually quite rare to find a Gothic Victorian pub. Perhaps the most striking part of this building is the corner turrell. Remember, it's a turrell rather than a turret if it doesn't go all the way down to the ground. It's topped with a conical copper roof, sometimes likened to a witch's hat, and it has a weather vane on top of that. It's particularly appealing, I think, when juxtaposed with the nearby BT Tower. The base is arcaded, and beneath that arcade is this carving including an enigmatic face looking at you as you enter the pub. That base has a Watney Combe reed lamp suspended from it today. I suspect that dates to the 1930s or earlier because they're still using the stag logo, the old logo for Watney's before the infamous red barrel came in. These features are curious, which I think the Historic England notes refer to as portal-like square columned stops. There are two on each side and they almost form little alcoves. It looks to me as though possibly at one time there may have been figurines, who knows, of a king and a queen inside those. There's gold lettering in the doors on the main entrance on the corner there with the initials K and Q for the pub. Looking inside, the bar counter is unusual in that you could just about turn the whole thing upside down and it would still look more or less the same. There is an overhead section going all the way up to the ceiling with fielded panelling in a similar style to the counter lower down. That upper section today is decorated with some portraits of former monarchs. Elsewhere, it has a very pubby interior with carpet, bar stools, banquette seating, and breweriana on at least some of the walls in the form of some of these brewery advertising mirrors. There's also some possibly quite venerable tiling in two places. At one of the now disused entrances, there is the pub name in tiling down there, and also the chap behind the bar pointed out that the gents' toilets has tiling, which is potentially quite old. This place is also well known for its antique tills. There is one behind the bar which possibly dates to the 1950s, and then as we move upstairs, the function room has an even older looking till, possibly that's even late Victorian. That upstairs room also has a couple of really attractive black and gold fireplaces, and they could well date back to the original rebuilding of the building in the 1890s or possibly early 1900s. There's a little bit of the Art Nouveau about them to me. A few sources cite that the pub was first established in 1767. I think it might actually be a bit later than that. The building opposite the pub was originally known as the Covent Garden Workhouse. Yes, I know we're quite some distance from Covent Garden, I don't quite know how it got that name. And then it was later known as the Strand Union Workhouse. That was apparently built in the mid-1770s, and at the time it was built, it was described as being insulated in the fields, according to Ruth Richardson's book Dickens and the workhouse. I don't think you'd use that description if it had a pub opposite it. Incidentally, there's a plaque to Charles Dickens a few doors down at 22 Cleveland Street, his first London home, and it has been suggested that the workhouse was the inspiration for Oliver Twist. Although when he first lived there he was only 3 or 4 years old, Dickens actually lived in that house twice, returning as a teenager, and he would have been here at the time he came of what we would regard today as drinking age, not that that particularly mattered in that point in history. So I'm fairly sure he would have known the King and Queen and quite possibly frequented it. I was curious as to which King and Queen the name of the pub is referring to, and I think there are 3 possible alternatives here. The most straightforward explanation is that it was the royal couple at the time the pub was first established. So assuming the pub was established sometime between 1760 and 1820, that would refer to King George III and his wife Queen Charlotte. In other parts of the country where this pub name appears, it's a reference to the joint monarchs William of Orange and Mary II in the late 17th century. I'm tempted to think it could be a 3rd possible derivation hinted at by the former names of the 2 streets that the pub finds itself on. The pub sits on the corner of 2 streets known today as Foley Street and Cleveland Street. On Horwood's map of 1799, Foley Street was known at that time as Queen Anne Street. That tantalisingly seems to give us one half of our pub name. We have a queen. Now, where did the king come from? Cleveland Street, or at least some of it, had the same name then that it does today, and that was apparently named for Charles Fitzroy, the 2nd Duke of Cleveland, or possibly his son, the 3rd Duke of Cleveland. The 2nd Duke of Cleveland was in fact an illegitimate son of King Charles II. Being illegitimate, he was of course never officially in line to the throne, and there are no accounts to suggest that he had any aspirations to be king. But again, it's tantalisingly close. A pub called the King and Queen, originally on the corner of one street called Queen Anne Street, and another street that had royal connections. The earliest written record I found for this pub is in the Sun Fire Office insurance records, and that goes back to 1783. At that time the victualler was Thomas Owens, and the address is given as Queen Anne Street East. It gets a mention in the London Gazette in 1795, at which time the landlord was a Mr. Raynham, and the location is described as the corner of Queen Anne Street East in the parish of St Mary le Bon. Of course, remembering that Fitzrovia is a modern name for this neighbourhood, only first being coined in the 1930s. Prior to that, this was all part of Marylebone, or Marylebone if you prefer. In more recent history, Bob Dylan apparently played his first ever performance outside of America here in 1962. It's fitting in a way that that would be here in Fitzrovia, having chosen his surname Dylan from Dylan Thomas, and this was of course the old stomping ground of Dylan Thomas. We covered that in that previous video on Fitzrovia. I believe the current owners of this pub, as noted, the same owners as those of the Red Lion in St James's on Crown Passage, took over in the 1980s, and I believe it's been a free house, an independent pub since then. Here is a look at what was on the bar lineup. Selection of 4 real ales there. I went for a pint of Sambrook's Junction. Really enjoying this. Great pub this, King and Queen. Good start to the tour. Pub number 2, the Ship on New Cavendish Street. Cheers from the Ship. I was recently at an event here with John Rogers. Prior to that event, I thought I should probably research the history of the pub just in case anybody asked about it while I was here. As it turned out, no one did. And so that's partly the reason for wanting to revisit it today. But also, I think it's just a really appealing pub, particularly for all this breweryana on the outside and on the inside, and the staff were really nice too. The current building dates to 1887. Again, it's listed, and Historic England describe it as ornate, free classical style. That's demonstrated in first floor windows with double Corinthian columns either side supporting chunky architraves and curved pediments. Between those 2 first floor windows is a relief panel with a depiction of a ship. Above that it has the rebuild date for the pub, 1887, and underneath that a panel with the name of the pub. The ground floor has pink granite pilasters, could be Swedish coastal, could be something from Aberdeenshire in Scotland. Possibly more eye-catching to the pub aficionado, though, are the relics of the former associations this pub had with 2 different breweries. Initially the Wenlock Brewery, and then later with Bass. We have these lamps with Bass on draft on the front and the ship on one side plus Freehouse on the other. A circular hanging sign at one end of the pub has again Bass on draft and points to the entrance to the saloon bar. Then behind those lamps we have advertising for the Wenlock Brewery, harking back to an earlier era of the pub. Those two eras are related, given that Bass somewhat indirectly, and I think gradually throughout the 1950s, acquired the Wenlock Brewery, and the Wenlock Brewery finally closed in 1962. I suspect this pub may have had a time as a Bass-tied house, having almost certainly previously been a Wenlock-tied house, but the pub's website says that it has been in the ownership of the current family for 60 years, and I think during that time it has mostly been an independent pub. That theme of breweryana continues on the interior, and it's also very pubby. There's a carpet, red banquette seating, bar stools also red covered, and mirrors and other knickknacks, including some taps, are they called spigots for casks. Cameron's Real Beer in West London, a publication of 1989, I think that's possibly a forerunner of the London Drinker, has some interesting notes on the interior of the pub. In particular, note the unique Charrington, Wenlock and Bass mirror made specially for the landlord to express his opinion as to what the merged Bass-Charrington group should have been called. And it's a completely unique artifact because it is advertising for a company that never existed. I would guess that dates to the 1960s, but it could have been more recent and retrospective. Thanks to that camera booklet, we at least know that it was there in 1989. There's also a note in that 1989 camera pub guide that there was at that time a snooker table upstairs. Alas, I don't think that's there anymore, but it had at one time been owned by John Pullman, a one-time world snooker champion. It's believed the pub was first established in the 1770s, and it was first known as the Centurion. When I first saw that name, I was a bit perplexed. It seems a bit incongruous that in the 18th century somebody would be naming a pub after something which recalls the Roman Empire. But it made sense when I discovered that Centurion had actually been used as the name for a long line of Royal Navy vessels. And in fact, the first of those was not technically a Royal Navy ship, because it was built in 1650 during the Interregnum. That quite possibly explains the name as well. Oliver Cromwell was, we are led to believe, quite fascinated with the Roman Empire. He saw parallels between it and his English Republic, and there are famously coins where Cromwell is depicted as a Roman emperor. So as part of his English Republican Navy, a ship was launched called the Centurion, and then later that became part of the Royal Navy and the name just stuck. 8 ships in total have taken that name, the last of them being the HMS Centurion, launched in 1911. Given the timing of when this pub was first established, I think the particular HMS Centurion they were referring to was either the one launched in 1732 or possibly the one that was launched just prior to this pub being established in 1774. The first of those was particularly famous in its day, having circumnavigated the globe with Commodore George Anson at the helm as part of the War of the Austrian Succession. The earliest written reference I found to the pub is in the Sunfire Office Insurance Records of 1785. At that time, the landlord was Samuel Malpas. Samuel Malpas was still running the pub in 1796 when he appears in the proceedings of the Old Bailey. He'd had 2 pewter pint pots stolen from him, and at that time the pub had been renamed to the Ship. It's possible, given those dates, that Samuel Malpas was in fact the first landlord of the pub, and tempting to think that he may have had some connection with HMS Centurion. Possibly he was even a crew member. As for how the name changed to the Ship, there is a painting held at the London Picture Archive, which, in order to show you, I would have to hand over more than the proceeds of this video. So alas, instead you're going to have to make do with this childish sketch I made of it myself. You can see there's something like a walled garden around the front of the pub, and that obscures any ground floor frontage that the pub may have had. And the only way that you can actually identify what the pub is at that time was this large projecting sign which depicted depicted a ship, possibly one of those HMS Centurion vessels. It's easy to imagine how people might have started colloquially referring to the pub as the ship, particularly at a point in history when still a third of adult males were illiterate. Today, as noted, it's an independent pub, and I think there is a lot to like about it. On that previous visit, when I was here for that event with John Rogers, there weren't any real ales available on that particular occasion. So when I came in this time, I just assumed that would also be the case today and went straight for a pint of Guinness. And then noticed they did actually have at least one hand pump on, Doom Bar. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but some people like it. Like I say though, great pub, really nice atmosphere on that evening of the event with John Rogers, really nice staff, great exterior and interior, loads of breweryana and knickknacks. And now it's fully decked out in its Christmas decorations, if you're into that sort of thing. So it's looking very festive. Pub number 3, the Yorkshire Grey. Cheers from the Yorkshire Grey. This pub featured briefly in the recent video I did on Savile Row, given that it was the same architect that designed the Burlington Arms, and I thought there were similarities between the two buildings. I didn't get to talk much about the pub's interior or history though, so I thought it deserved a revisit. Let's start by recapping the exterior. I think it dates to 1882 or 1883, and as noted, it is the handiwork of George Treacher. As noted previously, it has this sort of corner recess, which I think seems to be a hallmark of sorts of George Treacher, at least that's been present in the 2 pubs I've seen of his. Possibly these exaggerated keystones above the windows here on the 2nd floor are also Treacher-esque. They also appeared at the Burlington Arms. The ground floor frontage is today painted green, leaded and mottled glass in the windows in a style we've seen several times before in former Charrington's pubs. Particularly note that trim around the edges in green. That seems to be the hallmark of those former Charrington pubs. Those windows are likely interwar, but as camera points out, they've had more recent additions, given that the corners of those windows also feature a Yorkshire rose, and that's very much a signature of Sam Smith's brewery, so they're likely late 20th or early 21st century. Although it's not on camera's list of historic pub interiors, or their list of outstanding conversions and renovations, or is it refurbishments, there are some brief notes about the pub and its interior on their online pub guide. They say some original features have survived, including varnished dark wood and etched glass panels, especially at the rear of the ground floor bar. There's a set of what appear to be snob screens in a partition towards the back of that ground floor bar. I'm not sure if they're what camera is referring to when they mention those etched glass panels, because these likely wouldn't have been located on a freestanding partition like this. They'd of course have been on the bar counter. Plus of course, genuine Victorian pub partitions wouldn't have had a big gap in the middle like this one does. If you wanted to move between the different sections of the pub, you'd normally have to do that by going outside and coming back in again. I think the bar counter probably isn't original either, but as with all Sam Smith's pubs, they've done a really good job, I think, of keeping it in that late Victorian theme. There's also various knickknacks around the pub, reminding us that we are very close to BBC Broadcasting House, inaugurated in 1932. And with the closing of BBC Television Centre in White City in 2013, that is once again the headquarters of the BBC. So I assume it has a couple of empty offices at the moment. As the sign for the pub hints at, and also as written in the Dictionary of Pub Names, the name Yorkshire Grey almost certainly relates to a breed of Shire horse, one that was commonly used to pull brewery drays, the wagons traditionally used to deliver beer to pubs. Sam Smith's famously still used dray horses to deliver their beer to some of their local pubs in Yorkshire, and you can see why this particular pub here in London appealed to them. There are in fact 2 pubs today in London with this name, the other being over in Holborn, coincidentally on the corner of Gray's Inn Road. This is another pub with origins in the 1770s, so it would have existed at the time of Hallward's map of 1799. Like the King and Queen, this would have had an address on Queen Anne Street East, the corner of that street, and Middleton Buildings as it was known then. Curiously, there is a sign above me right now saying Middleton Place, formerly known as Middleton Buildings. Do they mean formerly rather than formally, as in officially. When the rest of Queen Anne Street East was renamed to Foley Street in the early 1800s, I think around 1810, this section took the name Foley Place. In 1852, an inquest was held here at the pub on the death of Baron Farkas Kameni, who had lived a few doors down on Foley Place. He was living here in exile, having fought to liberate Hungary, being a key figure in the 1849 Battle of Piski between the Hungarian Revolutionary Army and the Austrian Empire. He is depicted here in this drawing of 1852, defending the bridge at Piski. I believe he's probably the one standing on the post there. Prior to Kameni's death, an individual had been writing injurious letters to the London newspapers about him and the Hungarian cause. It was on reading the latest of these letters that Kameni collapsed and later died. The coroner remarked that to him there had never appeared a clearer case in which a poor creature had died of a broken heart than that. There's also an interesting passage about the importance of the freedom of the press. The coroner made it clear that the author of those letters could not be blamed for Kameni's death. As noted, today this is a Sam Smith's pub. Alas, not one of the ones that has any real ale, so it's just the keg taps. For a change, I went for their 4X Bitter. Pub number 4, and it's another Sam Smith's pub just round the corner from the Yorkshire Grey, the Horse and Groom. Cheers from the Horse and Groom on Great Portland Street. Surprisingly, this is not a listed building, and there is a suggestion of an 1895 remodelling, but critically that is a remodelling rather than a complete rebuild. So possibly some of the underlying fabric of this building goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's 4 stories in total in yellow stock brick with stucco dressings. That remodelling probably also gave us this lavish ground floor frontage that we're still enjoying today. There's an arcade on the first floor formed of 3 windows interspersed with 2 murals. Those murals, I believe, are more modern. They weren't there in the 1970s. Those spaces were previously used for brewery advertising, the beers on offer, etc. Today they've been painted with a depiction of a horse and presumably a groom, in keeping with the name of the pub. The ground floor has, I think, a really attractive bowed window in wood and etched glass. The walls either side and those 2 central pillars have faience tiles in orange and green. The pub did look quite similar to this in a photo from 1960 held at the London Picture Archive, but in the interim this was an in-coop pub, and I think some of these features were either lost or possibly just covered over. So it's great that Sam Smiths have now restored it to the way it looked prior to that era. Very attractive pub on the inside, in a similar style to we've seen at other late Victorian refurbishments from Sam Smiths. There is still a sense of some of those separate original rooms, and at the back there is also the billiards room, part of which is now used as a darts area. You can see the skylight overhead that is very common in those billiards rooms from late Victorian pubs. The rest of the pub has lots of dark hardwood fittings, etched glass, mirrors, and all of the usual tropes we find in these recreations of late Victorian pubs from Sam Smith's. Quick note on the name, looking at Hallward's map of 1799, I believe the Horse and Groom would at that time have been number 50 Great Portland Street. There has been some renumbering in the interim, and I think today it's 128. Note how adjacent to that there is an entrance to a stable yard, and it seems likely to me that that is where the name of the pub derives from. The Survey of London suggests that the pub has been here since 1760 and was one of the first buildings built on Great Portland Street. The earliest written reference I found to it is a Sunfire office insurance record dating to 1781, and at that time the victualler was one William Broughton. As noted, it is a Sam Smith's pub today. It's another one where they don't have any real ale, they don't have the old brewery bitter as some of the London Sam Smith's pubs do, but instead I've gone for their stout. I happen to think Sam Smith's stout is actually very, very good. Albeit keg, I am actually quite enjoying this. Wouldn't it be nice if the next pub was in a quieter location? Pub number 5, the Lucky Saint. Cheers from the Lucky Saint, and this is the last pub of today's tour, and if the concept underlying it is abhorrent to you, feel free to click away now. I know some of you will reel in horror at the thought of a pub that is now ran by a brewery who specialise in alcohol-free beer. They do, however, sell regular beer here as well. They had Timothy Taylor's Landlord on the hand pumps, albeit it was currently conditioning, not available, and one from St Austell. And there are also lower alcohol options as well as the no alcohol options. It's not really like me to keep up with the zeitgeist when it comes to pubs, but no and low alcohol beer does seem to have been a growing trend in the last few years, and I was keen to see what a pub that put those front and centre, that had those as the main focus, would be like. It is also a pub with 18th century origins, just like all of the ones we've seen today. And although today it takes the name of the brewery that now runs it, Lucky Saint, it was originally known as the Mason's Arms. Once again, this pub is a late Victorian rebuild, and according to the Survey of London, was rebuilt in 1898. We actually have the name of the architect here as well. It was H.J. Hollingsworth. I'd say there is at least a hint of that Queen Anne revival style that was popular at that time. It's mostly in red brick with a few trimmings which look like Portland stone. The features which make it possibly Queen Anne revival in style, to my eyes, are these carved brick panels with their foliage and floral features. On one of those there is what appears to be a depiction of the Green Man. What is it with Fitzrovia and the Green Man? There are at least two pubs of that name in this part of London. The ground floor frontage has wide arched windows surrounded by dark granite, possibly our old friend Larvikite. And there are various heads and or faces in the capitals of those pillars. It's also another pub with a Tyrrell at the corner. I think this one would be octagonal if completed on all 8 sides. There is a nice imposing scroll pediment over the door at the main entrance, and there are hanging baskets, although obviously they're not at their best as I'm filming this in November. Inside, I'm not sure if much of the fabric that we see today is original. The bar counter looks stylistically at least 1930s, but quite possibly is much more modern than that. The bar back definitely is quite modern. There is, however, at one end of the pub a fireplace which I could imagine could be originally Victorian. As noted, the Lucky Saint is very much a recent name for this pub. I think it just switched to that at some point in this decade, possibly around 2022. Its former name, the Mason's Arms, is quite a common pub name, and as we saw in that recent video on Savile Row, I think sometimes it might be a tribute to some of the builders, the stonemasons to be more precise, who are involved in the construction of the area, particularly given that tradition of the pub often being the first building of a new development, because that would then provide a space in which the workers, the builders, could be fed and watered, or perhaps I should say beered. The pub claims a date of first establishment of 1778. The earliest written record I found to it was a Sunfire Office insurance record from 1798. The pub appears in the Proceedings of the Old Bailey in 1838 in what has to be the shortest account of a court case I've come across so far. George Roffey was indicted for stealing a pewter pot from the pub. That seems to be a common problem in this part of London. It was valued at 1 shilling, which, adjusting for inflation, would be the equivalent of about £5 today. A testimony is given by a local resident who saw him leaving the pub with the pewter pot and apprehended him. That's followed by the daughter of the landlord at the time confirming that it was indeed a pot from this particular pub. Based on that evidence alone, it seems, Roffey was found guilty and transported for 7 years. In more recent history, actor and radio presenter Wilfred Pickles was apparently a local here, as pointed out by this article in 1970, wherein celebrities of the day were asked to name their favourite London pub. He was probably most famous for his radio show Have a Go, which ran from I think the 1940s to the 1960s, and he presented that with his wife Mabel. One of the catchphrases of that show was, "What's on the table, Mabel?" I wanted to conclude my time at the Lucky Saint with some closing thoughts on the beer, but I wasn't really happy with any of the footage I took while I was there. I should preface this by saying I'm not trying to promote no or low alcohol beer here. I'm just looking at it with a sort of academic curiosity. I had a half of Lucky Saint lager while I was there. It's unfiltered and made using Hallertau hops, so overall it's more like a proper German Pilsner or maybe even a Kölsch than most of the standard keg lagers you normally get in pubs. As a lager, it's not really the style of beer I'd choose normally, but I can see the company has gone to some lengths to make a quality product. They follow the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, for example. I thought it was a bit nicer on draft than when I'd previously tried this in a bottle, a bit livelier and fresher tasting, albeit it is still just from a keg. I think it's a bit more challenging to make an alcohol-free, or at least a very low alcohol cask beer, given that secondary fermentation, but I read that that has been done. It would have been nice to see a no or low alcohol bitter on offer at the Lucky Saint pub. I believe Harvey's do a 0.5% ABV version of Sussex Best now. I haven't tried it, but that sounds promising. Well, that's going to be it for this video. I realised I didn't do an outro, so I've popped into the Green Man here. I've become briefly fascinated by green men, green man pubs. I saw this one actually predates all of those pubs we visited today. On an earlier 1700s map of Fitzrovia, this was here before the rest of Fitzrovia was, so possibly something to investigate on a future occasion. Today it's a very modern Green King pub, horrible turquoisey paint, but they did have Moorland Original, which I haven't seen for quite some time. Cheers.